On March 28, 1980, a group of Israeli archaeologists were called to salvage the contents of an apparently unremarkable ancient tomb. It contained a number of bone boxes, or ossuaries. At first glance, they seemed like thousands of others found throughout the Jerusalem hills. But this tomb held a remarkable secret, one that had the potential to rock the foundations of Christianity. Evidence to suggest that the bones found there may be those of Jesus Christ.
If Jesus' physical remains were discovered, that would be the end of traditional Christianity.
Could science unlock the tomb's ancient secrets? And would it reveal the truth about the life and death of Jesus Christ? Over 2 billion Christians around the world believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God who rose from the dead. For 2,000 years, they have believed that Jesus died on the cross and was placed in an empty tomb. The faith says that then, 3 days later, he rose from the dead before ascending to heaven, leaving no mortal remains on earth.
Christianity actually begins with the proclamation that Jesus had been raised from the dead, that God had interacted on Jesus' behalf and brought him back physically from the dead and had taken him up to heaven.
To be a Christian is to believe in the resurrection and the ascension. If Jesus' human remains were found on earth, the faith of billions of people would be shattered. It was spring 1980 when archaeologists Amos Kloner and Shimon Gibson were called to excavate a seemingly ordinary tomb. A chance discovery on a construction site in the Jerusalem suburb of Talpiot, 3 miles east of the city center. Today, they are world authorities on the archaeology of first-century Jerusalem. Back then, Amos was a district archaeologist and Shimon a 22-year-old rookie. Little did they know they were stumbling across one of the most controversial archaeological finds of all time. A tomb from the time of Jesus. Carved into solid rock, the tomb contained a number of ossuaries, or bone boxes for the dead. This was rescue archaeology, a race against time. The tomb was unearthed on a building site, and when an archaeological find is discovered, construction has to stop. But big money is at stake. Archaeologists have a few days at most before they will be thrown off and construction will continue.
If you're in a situation where you have a burial cave and inside you have ossuaries, the stone bone boxes in which bones are kept, it's not a nice sort of atmosphere because you want to do the best possible work and you feel this threat looming over you.
Yet these archaeologists were investigating a crucial point in history: the first years of Christianity. Burial of the dead in chambered tombs and ossuaries was common for only 100 years. Between 30 BCE and 70 CE, covering the years of Jesus' life and death. Amos Kloner is the world's leading authority on burial practice in first-century Jerusalem.
After about 12 months, which means a winter, summer, the decaying of the flesh, they collected the bones and put them in the boxes we called ossuaries. Ossuaries are very common in the burials of Jerusalem.
In the Talpiot excavation, the archaeologists quickly recorded their findings. Then they removed the ossuaries. The bone boxes were taken to the Rockefeller Museum, the headquarters of the Israeli Antiquities Authority.
Well, back in 1980, when the finds were on the vehicle and brought here to the Rockefeller Museum, the first thing that would have been done would be to unpack the ossuaries, and those which had inscriptions on them and carvings were placed on shelves in the storeroom, which is behind me at the end of the corridor.
Out of respect for the dead, the bones were given to the Jewish authorities for reburial. The ossuaries themselves were kept in the museum. They were cleaned, and the inscriptions, written in Hebrew and Greek, were deciphered. It was here that archaeologists made a remarkable discovery. Carved on one of the ossuaries was an inscription that could rock the foundations of Christianity. Yeshua bar Yehosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. Was it possible that this limestone box had contained the bones of Jesus Christ? In the Jerusalem suburb of Talpiot, a routine tomb excavation revealed a collection of ossuaries, or bone boxes, one of which was inscribed, Jesus, son of Joseph. Professor of Religious History James Tabor is in Jerusalem researching the life of the historical Jesus. He believes the Talpiot ossuary could be the holy grail of biblical archaeology, physical evidence of the existence of Jesus Christ. Although Jesus is one of the most famous figures in history, the details of his life remain a mystery. However, one thing is clear: the historical Jesus wasn't a Christian. Christianity only came into being after he died.
The truth is, Jesus was Jewish, all 12 apostles were Jewish, even Paul was Jewish, and all the original followers of Jesus were Jewish. So hard for us to grasp 2,000 years later because we have the whole development of Christianity as a separate religion. But imagine if we go back 2,000 years, we go back to the time of the Second Temple. What was it like to go up to the temple, to encounter Jesus or even his followers? It would simply be another group of Jews. They would be indistinguishable from other groups of Jews.
Jerusalem in Jesus' day was a city under occupation. The Romans ruled Judea with an iron hand. Then, 40 years after Jesus' death, everything changed.
In 70 AD, this whole temple came down, at least to the foundation stones that you can see, and this is the rubble left from it. There was a great revolt, and the Romans put it down very decisively. It lasted until 73 AD. And the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed.
But in the hills surrounding the modern city, evidence of the customs of Jesus' day is still preserved in rock-cut tombs like these. The tomb in Talpiot is a typical family tomb. It's the collection of names inside that is exceptional. As well as the Jesus son of Joseph bone box, there are several other inscribed ossuaries, clues that suggest Talpiot could be the family tomb of Jesus Christ. There is Maria in Hebrew, a form of Mary. Then there is Mariamne, written in Greek, another form of Mary. There is also Yosei in Hebrew, a nickname for Joseph.
You know, if you raise a hypothetical question, a Jesus family tomb, if he were buried in the normal Jewish fashion, let's say right here in Jerusalem, we're surrounded here by family tombs, who would likely be in such a tomb? If his mother died, then hypothetically, she could be in the tomb, particularly as a widow.
According to the inscriptions, there are two Marys in the tomb. One is the version Maria, the name Jesus' mother is sometimes referred to in the Gospels. Over the years, Mary, the mother, has become a pivotal figure in Christianity. But one of the lesser-known facts of the New Testament is that Jesus also had brothers and sisters, a fact the Vatican would like to ignore. After all, according to Catholic tradition, Mary is supposed to be a virgin mother.
You know, the odd thing about the family of Jesus, and I mean his brothers, his sisters, to some degree even his mother, is the church has largely forgotten them. Now, Mary, certainly the mother, hasn't been forgotten in the sense that she's not known, but she's been forgotten as the Jewish mother of 7 children. She's now seen as the exalted heavenly lady who in Catholic tradition is even taken bodily into heaven. Well, if we come back down to earth and go to the 1st century, we see this woman with these 4 boys and at least 2 girls struggling and working along with Jesus, the eldest, trying to make a living. And that side of the family is just practically erased.
Using the Gospels as a source, modern historians have recreated Jesus' family tree. He had 2 sisters, thought to be Mary and Salome. But if they were married, they would be buried with their husbands. He had 4 brothers. But Judah and Simon wouldn't be in the tomb. There is a written record of them after 70 CE, when the practice of ossuary burial ceased. That leaves James and Joseph.
Joseph, he had a nickname Yossi or Yose. He could be in a hypothetical Jesus tomb.
And there is a Yose buried in the Talpiot tomb. He is further evidence that this might be the tomb of Jesus. But there is another brother who should be in the tomb, James, a key figure in the early church. He became the leader of the Jesus movement after the crucifixion.
James had been killed, according to Josephus, the Jewish historian. He was actually killed. He was murdered very brutally right here near where we're standing. He was thrown off one of the walls and beaten to death. So he becomes a martyr before the destruction. He was killed in the year 63.
So where is he? Why isn't he in the Talpiot tomb? Christian tradition says that James was buried near the Temple Mount in this tomb, carved in the Kidron Valley. But recently, an ossuary appeared on the Israeli antiquities market bearing the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Some scholars believe this ossuary might have been stolen from the Talpiot tomb before the official excavation. But could science provide any evidence? The patina, a thin weathered layer that forms on the outside of an ossuary, was analyzed. If the chemistry of the James ossuary matched the Talpiot ossuaries, it would suggest they came from the same tomb. Editor of the Jerusalem Post, David Horowitz, has been following the story closely.
Patina test demonstrated that the James and the Talpiot tomb ossuaries are from the same period, kept in the same place, exposed to the same conditions, because apparently the findings on the patina, the scientific findings, the components of the patina, are identical.
This was scientific evidence that the James ossuary could have come from Talpiot. It was a further clue to support the idea that this might be the Jesus family tomb. But another ossuary from the tomb poses the controversial question about who might be in that family. Carved on its side was a particularly rare name. Epigrapher Jonathan Price is an expert on 1st century inscriptions.
The scholar who made the first interpretation of this inscription, Rahmani, who was a very good scholar, read the letters as follows. He first saw a mu, an M, alpha, an A, rho, an R, iota, an I, alpha, an A, mu again, an M, Mariam. Then he saw an eta, which in Greek is an A sound. So Mariame, and then he read a nun. This is like an N, a backwards N. Then he saw OU, Omicron Upsilon. This next little scratch here, he read as a sign for a letter, eta. Then he read M-A-R-A, Mu Alpha Rho Alpha. He interpreted this as follows. Mariam ne nu, that is of Mariam ne, who, hey, who is also Mara.
This was a crucial discovery. This woman was called Mariamne, an ancient variation on the name Mary. And she was given the title Mara, or Master. According to James Tabor, there is only one woman in ancient literature who was ever called Mary the Master.
Mara is master in feminine, and Mariamne, with the N sound on the N, is only known in all of Greek literature in 2 other texts. It's very, very rare. And in both texts, it's a reference to Mary Magdalene.
But if Mariamne the Master really is Mary Magdalene, what is her relationship to Jesus? And why would they share the same tomb? One answer is that she was the favorite disciple. There's no hint of this in the New Testament, but there is a group of Christian texts that imply Mary Magdalene played a much bigger role in the Jesus movement. Called the Gnostic Gospels, they give an insight into traditions that have vanished from Orthodox Christianity. One of them, the Gospel of Mary, describes Mary Magdalene as a leader amongst the disciples.
In this gospel, it's about Mary Magdalene. She's a leader, a teacher, a Mara, a kind of lord in the feminine. In fact, Peter, the chief apostle, is jealous of her. There's a bit of rivalry going on. And so that gospel preserves for us a stream of tradition in which Mary was honored, remembered, and put in a very high place.
Another, more controversial theory is that Jesus and Mary Magdalene could have been married. To many, this is a blasphemous proposition. But one of the Gnostic Gospels does suggest they were more than just friends.
The Gospel of Philip, there's a passage here where she's called a companion of Jesus. And it says he loved her more than all the disciples, and he used to kiss her often. And actually, some translations say on the mouth. But just that notion of intimate affection and so forth, you're not going to find that in the Synoptic Gospels in our New Testament. She's barely mentioned.
Certainly, if Jesus was living as a normal Jewish man of the 1st century, one would expect him to be married. A shocking rewrite of the life of Christ, a man believed to have been single and celibate. But could science test the possibility of a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene? Remarkably, scientists managed to extract human remains from the Jesus and Mariamne ossuaries. They wanted to test the DNA to see if they could establish a bloodline. If there was no bloodline, there was the possibility they were married. The analysis was carried out by paleo-DNA expert Carney Matheson.
When you're dealing with aged samples, aged skeletal material or any other, hair, teeth and what have you, it's very, very difficult. When we extract the DNA, there's a couple of types we can look at. We can look at nuclear DNA, which can be fairly difficult to extract, or you can look at mitochondrial DNA, which is found in thousands of copies within each cell, and therefore the quantity is greater, and it's a lot easier to analyse. And that's, of course, what we did in these particular samples. When you look at mitochondrial DNA, you're limited to identify maternal relationships. In this particular case, we identified a genetic profile from each of the samples submitted, and they were not the same. Because the mitochondrial profiles were not the same, these two individuals are not maternally related.
So if they didn't share a mother, what was the connection between these two? And why are they in the same tomb?
This is a family tomb. People have been buried together. Well, if they're not members of the same family, they must be husband and wife. Those particular ossuaries, well, that must have been Jesus and his wife, Mary Magdalene. It's a very sensational claim, of course.
It was a controversial conclusion. Not only did the Talpiot tomb contain a Mary that could be the mother of Jesus and a Jose that could be his brother, it appeared to contain the bones of a woman who was Mary Magdalene and who could have been married to Jesus Christ. But there was one other revelation in store. The tomb also contained an ossuary inscribed, Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus. This raises the shocking question, could Jesus Christ have had a son?
If you ask Jesus married with children, within Judaism they go together. The first commandment, the mitzvah of the Torah, is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so if you're married, you have children. It's considered part of your life on this earth to leave behind your posterity. And so if he were married, I would think he would have children.
The evidence from Talpiot suggests not only that Jesus came from a very human Jewish family, but that he had a wife and child who were all buried together in a family tomb. It's a possibility that challenges the very foundation of Christianity.
Traditionally, Christianity has been a belief in Jesus' death and resurrection. Since the early first century, when this belief was first propounded, the belief has been that the resurrection meant that Jesus actually was physically raised from the tomb. That's why in the New Testament you have stories about women visiting the tomb and finding it empty.
So what does the Christian New Testament tell us about the death and resurrection of Jesus? It states he was crucified by the Romans on a Friday at a place called Golgotha on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It tells us that Jesus died on the cross and that his body was handed to Joseph of Arimathea, an influential follower, for burial. Because Jewish law forbids work on the Sabbath, the body was left in a vacant tomb. Then, on Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene came to anoint the body, but she found the tomb empty. In the days and weeks that followed, Jesus appeared to Mary and the disciples. Later, they reported that he had risen from the dead.
I think the importance of Jesus historically has to be traced back to the belief that he was raised from the dead. It was only because Jesus' followers said he got raised from the dead, and they acquired converts who then converted other people who converted other people, so that the religion snowballed and became an important religion within the empire. It's only because of that that Jesus has become the household name that he is today. It's the belief in the resurrection that exalts Jesus to a status of equality with God, whereas probably in his public ministry, his followers didn't understand him that way at all. They simply understood him as a great Jewish teacher.
But what if Jesus was simply a Jewish teacher, and his mortal remains were found in an ossuary in Jerusalem? Does that mean the resurrection and ascension become just legends? In 1980, archaeologists found a first-century tomb in Jerusalem containing a number of bone boxes inscribed with biblical names, including Jesus, son of Joseph. 25 years later, scientists found evidence to suggest that this tomb held the physical remains of Jesus Christ. It's an assertion that challenges the core of Christianity as we know it today. Yet history tells us Jesus knew nothing of Christianity. He was a Jew, and the movement he started began in the hills of Galilee as an insignificant sect of Judaism. The man who took Jesus' teachings to the wider world was St. Paul. Paul started out as a persecutor of the Jesus movement before becoming a devout convert himself. In the decades after Jesus' death, he took the ministry to Gentiles as well as Jews across the Roman Empire. Key to his message was a belief in the divine nature and bodily resurrection of Jesus. This became the foundation of Christian thought as it evolved from its Jewish roots and spread throughout the Western world.
It would be impossible to be a traditional Orthodox Christian without the belief in the physical resurrection, because as Christianity developed over the centuries, this belief that Jesus had physically, bodily been raised from the dead was the very cornerstone of the traditional faith.
That faith is challenged by the Talpiot theory. But the Talpiot tomb is buried beneath this concrete slab in a suburb on the edge of Jerusalem. It is 3 miles away from the traditional site of Golgotha, considered to lie in the heart of the old city, in the Holy Sepulchre Church, Christianity's most sacred site. This tradition is supported by most scholars and archaeologists, including Shimon Gibson, one of the original excavators of the Talpiot tomb, and now a leading authority on 1st century Jerusalem. He has gained access to a unique excavation deep beneath the church.
At the time of Jesus, this was a partly abandoned stone quarry. Perfect place for crucifixion because it was not in use, and also a good place to carve your rock-cut tomb, because you have these amazing rock-cut scarps on all sides, and all you need to do is simply cut into the side of a rock scarp and create your tomb. So in terms of the archaeological finds, they confirm very well that this is a very suitable location for Golgotha.
But if Jesus really was crucified where the Holy Sepulchre stands, doesn't that make it unlikely he'd end up buried 3 miles away in a tomb in Talpiot? Apparently not, according to Professor James Tabor.
Jewish law required that bodies not be left hanging overnight, and unless the Romans were very upset and wanted to offend the population in a time of stress or revolt, they would tend to follow this custom just to keep the peace. You think about when Jesus died, it's Passover. There are hundreds of thousands of people camped out all on these hills behind me, going to the festival. And the last thing you want is a revolt on your hands. So I think it makes sense that Pilate would have allowed Jesus to be properly buried as a Jew.
Jewish law states that a body must be buried within 24 hours of death. But not on the Sabbath, which runs from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset.
The earliest record is the Gospel of Mark. What Mark says, and it's also repeated by Luke and by John, is quite interesting. That Joseph took the body down, and then it says because of the emergency situation that the holiday, that the Passover is so near, hours away on that Friday afternoon, that he put the body in a tomb near the place of the crucifixion.
This is the tomb at Golgotha, mentioned in the Gospels. According to the Talpiot theory, it's a temporary solution. Joseph of Arimathea doesn't want to leave Jesus longer than necessary in a tomb owned by strangers.
Then as soon as the festival's over, which would be Saturday night, you're going to come and get that body and put it in a more permanent location. I don't think it's all the way up in Galilee. That's 3 days' journey, too far away. And so it'd be right here in Jerusalem, and eventually others of his family would join him. And that's what we have at Talpiot.
This idea that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus' body from Golgotha to Talpiot is controversial, but doesn't contradict the New Testament. And it does explain why his mortal remains might be found in a Jerusalem suburb 2,000 years later. But what about the other shocking assertion of the Talpiot theory? that Jesus was buried with a wife and child. How does that stand up to further scrutiny?
Central to the assessment is that Jesus was a married man with a son. I mean, that is integral to this being a credible claim. This is Jesus, the married man, the father, buried with other members of his family in this tomb in Talpiot.
But is there any evidence in the Gospels or any other ancient texts to suggest Jesus was a father?
There is no evidence in any early source whatsoever that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene or married to anyone else. In fact, in all of our early sources, Jesus is portrayed as a single celibate Jewish man. And so this idea that Jesus was married is a complete invention of modern times. In none of our Gospels is there any reference to this at all.
One thing to keep in mind, though, is women and wives are generally written out of the history. Silence means nothing. Name Peter's wife, Andrew's wife, James' wife, any of the 12 apostles. They were all married. Not a single one do we know the names of their wives. Now, we can also talk about a Jewish male, age 30, it's proper to marry in that culture and that sort of thing. And the likelihood, then, that he would be married is there culturally.
Some people have maintained that Jesus would not be a single celibate man because in ancient Judaism, men were always married. And it's true that it was the accepted norm, but there were a lot of exceptions. We know of a lot of Jews who, in fact, were single and celibate for religious reasons. For example, the Jews who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, found in the desert caves of Qumran, are one of the most sensational archaeological finds of the 20th century. They contain the earliest copy of the Hebrew Old Testament ever discovered. They also contain sectarian writings describing a Jewish vision of the apocalypse, the end of days. Professor Tal Ilan is an expert on ancient Jewish texts.
In Qumran, we found many writings that describe what the end of days would look like. For example, there will be an enormous war between the few elect sons of light and the many wicked people who populate the earth, the sons of darkness. And of course, in the end, the sons of light will prevail and will win this war. And the people who lived here were preparing themselves for this apocalyptic, catastrophic end of days.
Scholars don't know if Jesus went to Qumran or not, but they do believe he was one of those first-century Jews who thought the apocalypse was imminent.
There are a number of sayings of Jesus in the Gospels in which Jesus indicates quite clearly that he thinks that the end of time is coming imminently, that he thinks it's right around the corner. Jesus tells his disciples, for example, "Some of you standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power." Mark chapter 9, verse 1.
These texts are evidence that Jesus might not be in the Talpiot tomb, because they suggest there is no reason for him to be married.
Jesus himself said that in the kingdom of God there'd be neither marriage nor giving in marriage. He also said that people need to implement the ideals of the kingdom in the present. So it's not at all implausible that Jesus tried to implement that ideal in the present by not getting married, showing what life in the kingdom would be like.
Ancient texts contain clues that Jesus may have stayed single for religious reasons. This is circumstantial evidence, but it does raise doubts about a possible marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Another blow to the Talpiot theory is the interpretation of the DNA test. It's not as conclusive as first impressions suggested.
To make the assumption that these two are married is a little bit of a leap. If they're unrelated individuals, they could be husband and wife. But there's other unrelated individuals within a family tomb, which are the spouses of other family members. So 2 unrelated individuals is not enough to come to the conclusion that they must have been married.
So there's no definite conclusion that whoever was in the Mariamne and Jesus ossuaries were husband and wife. And because the remains are now buried in a communal grave, it is impossible to conduct further tests. A further argument against the Talpiot theory is that many scholars disagree with the initial interpretation of the Mariamne inscription. Epigrapher Jonathan Price has his own interpretation.
The first problem with the interpretation was interpreting this little scratch here as a letter, as an intended part of the inscription. There are scratches like this all over the box. You see them around the inscription. Here's another scratch, here's another one, here's another one. These are, of course, not interpreted as letters, and there's no reason to interpret this as a letter either. And the second mistake was to read this letter as an N. And in fact, it's a kappa, it's a K. So this is the Greek word kai. Kai in Greek means and. So it could be Mariamne and Mara. That is, there were 2 people in this ossuary. One was named Mariamne, and the other was named Mara.
Putting the bones of 2 people in one ossuary was common practice. But what does this mean for the theory that Mary Magdalene was buried in the Talpiot tomb?
This ossuary gives no clear evidence that this is the burial place of Mary Magdalene, or really any particular Mary or Mariam that we know from literary texts. There's, in my mind, no reason to think so.
So there's no concrete evidence that the person interred in the Mariamne ossuary was Mary Magdalene. Yet this link is crucial in the case for Talpiot being the tomb of Jesus. The original excavators also have grave doubts about the Talpiot theory. Shimon Gibson thinks they would have noticed straight away if there'd been a crucified man in the tomb.
Had there been the remains of a crucified man in the Talpiot tomb, the anthropologists who opened the ossuaries, when they reached the Rockefeller Museum, since there had already been a discovery in the late 1960s of a crucified man in Givat HaMiftar, which is on the north side of Jerusalem, the anthropologists would have recognized the signs.
What archaeologists found in the other tomb was remarkable. This piece of heel bone with a large nail driven through it. If a crucified man was buried at Talpiot, the signs would have been hard to miss.
So I think there's negative evidence here, but it does mean that there was no crucified man in the Talpiot tomb.
One of the other excavators from 1980 believes there are further signs that cast doubt on the Talpiot theory. The theory depends on the idea that Jesus was the first person buried in the tomb. Amos Kloner thinks the large size of the tomb and the number of niches, or kochim, are evidence Talpiot was already well established by the time Jesus died.
In the famous cave of East Talpiot, we have clear evidence that it was used for more than 30 or 40 years. Is what I'm calling a mature cave. The way that the 10 ossuaries were put in the kuchim, it's a clear evidence that this cave was used for burials, at least for 80, maybe even 100 years.
Amos Kloner believes the Talpiot tomb was probably started around 20 BCE by a family who had no connection whatsoever with the historical Jesus.
Of my understanding, it has nothing to do with this family.
With evidence against the Talpiot theory building up, the likelihood of a Jesus family tomb was beginning to look dubious. Yet the cluster of names is representative of the New Testament family. So how significant is that cluster? What can the science of statistics tell us about the chance that Talpiot might really be the last resting place of Jesus Christ? A tomb excavated in Jerusalem contained a number of bone boxes or ossuaries with a remarkable collection of inscriptions. Amongst them were Jesus, son of Joseph, 2 Marys, and a rare form of Joseph, Jose, which is the nickname used by Jesus' brother in the Gospels. But just how significant is this cluster of names? With the help of statistics, we can tell the probability of the Talpiot tomb belonging to Jesus of Nazareth, as opposed to Jesus the Builder or Jesus the Grocer. Professor Tal Ilan is an expert on first-century texts and inscriptions.
Joseph was the second most popular name. Jesus was like the 6th most popular name. And together they would have formed something like maybe 8 or 10% of the population, of the male population. There must have been dozens of Jesus, son of Joseph, in the Second Temple period. Any tomb you'd look at the time would have a similar combination of names. I'd say that these are the most popular names you'd find at the time anywhere, and any tomb you'd look at the time would have a similar combination of names.
But James Tabor thinks the cluster of names is more significant than Tal Ilan believes.
On the one hand, the names could be seen to be quite common. But as you begin looking at it and studying it a bit, it tightens up considerably. First of all, it's not just any Jesus, it's Jesus, son of Joseph. So if we had a stadium of 50,000 people and we said, all the Jesuses, please rise, we would get about, 5% of the people. But if we then said, now those of you who are standing, did you have a father named Joseph? Half would sit down, and then a mother named Mary. But the real key, I think, is the possibility of a brother in that tomb. His name is Joseph. So who had a brother named Joseph? Suddenly you get down to just a couple of people who had all of that together as a cluster. So it's not simply the names, but the cluster of names.
Is this combination of a Jesus, son of Joseph, with a Jose and a Mary, statistically significant? Is it rare enough to suggest that Talpiot is the tomb of Jesus Christ? In Tel Aviv, leading Israeli statistician Camille Fuchs has analyzed the probability.
If we look at all the data, I would say the following. It is unlikely, from my point of view, that it is Jesus' tomb, but it is possible. I would say that the probability, if we want to put a probability on that, I would put a probability at about 10% to 20%. We cannot say that the probability is virtually nil. We have to remember that there is an ossuary inscribed as Jesus, son of Joseph. There is another ossuary inscribed Maria. There is another ossuary inscribed Jose. All those together, they are quite surprising, but not as surprising as to make it statistically significant.
The statistics add to the weight of evidence which suggests it's unlikely that Jesus was ever buried beneath the tower blocks of Talpiot. But whoever was buried there, James Tabor still thinks the tomb is significant in bringing us closer to Jesus the man, the Jesus of history.
Whether we could show it's Jesus of Nazareth or not, to go into that tomb, a Jewish tomb of the 1st century, to see these very names reminds us we're talking about a human being, a real family with family ties who buried their loved ones like people have done through the ages. It gives you a sense of reality. It's right here on earth with the stuff of death, of burial, of mourning, of sadness. You know, the very human things that we all know.
Shimon Gibson reckons the case against the tomb is already strong enough.
My feeling is that if we were really to lay open all of the information about these tombs to the general public, they would be convinced that this The Talpiot tomb is not the family tomb of Jesus.
And Shimon Gibson believes the Jesus family tomb could actually be in the Holy Sepulchre Church, just meters away from the site of crucifixion and the empty tomb.
Well, this is the traditional tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which is situated only a stone's throw away from the traditional tomb of Jesus. But it seems to me that if that was the tomb of Jesus, then his family would have wanted to have been buried nearby, and where better but in this tomb. So maybe it has been misidentified. Maybe this is, in fact, the family tomb of Jesus.
Scholars will argue about the Talpiot tomb for years to come. But the bigger question remains a mystery. What happened after the crucifixion? Some believe the disciples hallucinated Jesus' return and told of a resurrection. Some believe he survived the crucifixion to live on. Yet others believe he was raised spiritually, not bodily. So where his mortal remains ended up is of no importance. Maybe we will never know the truth. But whatever happened, the story of the resurrection and the promise of a life after death gripped the human imagination, providing the foundation of a movement which has endured for almost 2,000 years: Christianity.